The morning kicked off with something no one in our calm, predictable suburban neighborhood could have seen coming. At exactly 6:03 a.m., I was in the kitchen sipping coffee from my favorite mug, when the sharp, rhythmic thump of tactical boots on concrete cut through the early silence. Peering through the front window, I watched in total disbelief as an entire SWAT team swarmed my property, rifles drawn and aimed directly at my freshly planted petunias. A megaphone cracked open with a staticky burst, followed by a commanding voice booming through the cool dawn air. "This is the police SWAT unit. Exit your residence immediately with your hands visible. We have reports of a fortified compound and possible weapons on site." I almost spit out my coffee. A fortified compound? I glanced around my modest 3-bedroom ranch-style house with its faded beige siding and wondered how on earth anyone could mistake it for a military stronghold. But the officers weren't confused. They were fully surrounding my home, treating my tomato patch like it was a staging area for armed conflict. Honestly, the absurdity might have been funny if there weren't actual assault rifles pointed at my property. What in the world had brought a SWAT team to my doorstep at sunrise? The truth was even more ridiculous than the scene unfolding outside. Our HOA president, Karen, had told dispatch that I was constructing an underground bunker, and according to the 911 recording I later obtained, she said they should, and I quote, "shoot if he resists." Let me back up and explain how a retired accountant like me somehow became the target of a militarized neighborhood meltdown. My name is David Morrison, and 3 years ago, I moved to Maple Ridge Estates seeking a peaceful place to enjoy retirement. It looked perfect at first: tree-lined streets, tidy homes, quiet corners. What I didn't realize then was that Maple Ridge Estates doubled as the personal fiefdom of Karen, a woman who wielded the HOA presidency like she'd been appointed dictator for life. Karen was the type of person who took a ruler to people's lawns every Tuesday and issued violation letters if the grass dared to exceed 3.5 inches. She wore designer athletic gear despite never actually breaking a sweat, and carried a clipboard like it was part of her anatomy. Her husband rarely spoke, likely because Karen filled every available moment with her own commentary. She had a talent for turning the smallest inconvenience into a community-wide emergency. One time, she called an urgent HOA meeting because someone's trash can had been visible from the street for 30 whole minutes after collection. My problems with Karen began subtly. First came a $25 fine for leaving my recycling bin out past noon on pickup day, even though the truck hadn't arrived yet. Then she complained about the bird feeder I'd installed, claiming it drew undesirable wildlife. When I reminded her that birds were generally considered desirable, she shifted the accusation to the seed shelf, ls causing a slipping hazard on the sidewalk 15 feet away. After that, the fines just kept coming. My mailbox was allegedly 2 degrees off perpendicular. A suspicious oil stain on my driveway turned out to be a wet leaf. My fence, she claimed, was the wrong shade of white, even though it was that exact color when I bought the house. Things really escalated when I started a vegetable garden in my backyard. According to Karen, I needed HOA approval for any landscaping alterations. I filed the paperwork, waited the required 30 days, and received official approval from the architectural committee. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She began patrolling my property line with a measuring tape, insisting my tomato plants exceeded the maximum vegetation height. She snapped photos over my fence and blitzed the entire neighborhood with daily emails about my so-called agricultural violations. The whole situation veered into surreal territory when I decided to install a basic irrigation system for the garden. I rented a small trencher and dug an 18-inch deep channel to lay PVC piping for sprinklers. A perfectly normal one-day homeowner project. But from her second-story window, binoculars in hand, which she swore were for bird-watching, Karen became convinced I was plotting something sinister. She started telling neighbors I was digging defensive structures and preparing for a confrontation with the government. I tried clearing things up, even showing her my hardware store receipts and irrigation plans. But once Karen decided on a narrative, reality wasn't invited. She filed a complaint with the city, claiming I was excavating without permits. The city inspector came, checked everything, and confirmed no permits were required. Karen escalated to the county. They found nothing wrong. Then she contacted the state environmental agency, claiming I was disturbing protected wetlands in my bone-dry backyard. Each time officials came out and found zero violations, Karen grew more frantic. She began dragging other HOA board members into the crusade. She convinced Harold Garrison, the treasurer, that my digging would damage underground utilities. She told Susan Fletcher, the secretary, that I was likely burying hazardous waste. She even suggested to Tom Bradley, the vice president, that I might be building a bunker to dodge property taxes, a theory with absolutely no logical foundation, though Tom nodded along anyway. The harassment campaign intensified. Karen started sending me violation notices daily, sometimes multiple in a single day. She said my garden violated neighborhood aesthetic guidelines even though none existed in the CC and Rs. She claimed my compost tumbler attracted rodents, despite it being a sealed design specifically meant to prevent pests. She accused me of running an illegal agricultural business just because I handed some spare tomatoes to my neighbor. Then came the night everything spiraled. I was working late in my home office when I heard rustling in the backyard. Peeking out the window, I saw someone moving through my garden with a flashlight. I flicked on the exterior lights, and there stood Karen in my yard at 11:30 p.m. armed with her clipboard and camera, taking photos of the irrigation trenches. I stepped outside and demanded to know what she thought she was doing. She insisted she was conducting an emergency HOA inspection and claimed she had the authority to enter any property at any hour if she suspected violations. I told her to leave immediately, or I would call the police. With a smug look, she told me she'd be calling them first, then stormed off into the night. I assumed it was just another empty threat. I had no idea she was planning something far worse. The next morning, Karen marched straight to the sheriff's department and filed a dramatic report claiming I had threatened her during what she called a lawful inspection, insisting I behaved aggressively. She described the trenches in my yard and spun a wildly imaginative narrative about me constructing fortifications and possibly hoarding weapons. The deputy who arrived to investigate was polite, but noticeably doubtful. After examining my now fully installed, functioning irrigation system, he let out a quiet sigh and shook his head. He told me Karen had made some outrageous allegations, but that everything he saw was perfectly normal. He recommended I consider getting security cameras, especially after the trespassing incident. That advice turned out to be the smartest thing anyone had suggested in months. I installed a full security system with motion-activated cameras covering every inch of my property. The footage was backed up to the cloud and sent instant alerts to my phone whenever anyone came near. Within a week, I had captured Karen trespassing 3 more times. Twice during the day, while I was simply out grabbing groceries, and once at 2 a.m. where she spent nearly 20 minutes crawling around my garden with a flashlight, measuring my tomato stakes. But Karen still wasn't done. When her direct confrontations failed, she switched tactics and started spreading ridiculous rumors around the neighborhood. She told people I was a sovereign citizen preparing for a government showdown. She said I had threatened her multiple times, even though our only exchanges involved me asking her to get off my property. She insisted my irrigation trenches were defensive positions and insinuated I might be dangerous. Most neighbors brushed off her claims as classic Karen exaggeration, but a few began keeping their distance. The breaking point came when Karen escalated things to an extreme no one anticipated. She dialed 911 and reported that I had built an armed compound in my backyard and might possess weapons. She informed the dispatcher that I was anti-government, that I'd issued threats, and then she delivered the words that would ultimately be her undoing, if they resist. Shoot. She actually instructed police to shoot me if I didn't comply. The dispatcher, thankfully well trained, pressed her for details, but Karen insisted it was an emergency and demanded immediate action. She claimed she saw me carrying suspicious containers which were nothing more than bags of mulch into my shed, and said I had grown unpredictable. According to her, the entire neighborhood was in imminent danger, and urgent intervention was necessary. Following protocol for potential weapons situations, the dispatcher sent a significant response team. And just like that, we loop back to the morning when a SWAT team surrounded my home at dawn. I stepped out of my front door slowly, hands visible, wearing nothing but my bathrobe and slippers. The lead officer approached carefully and asked if I was David Morrison. I confirmed I was and asked what was going on. He explained they had received reports of a fortified compound and weapons. I couldn't help it, I actually laughed, overwhelmed by the sheer insanity of the accusation. Probably not the smartest reaction in front of armed officers, but the absurdity was impossible to ignore. I invited the entire team to inspect my property. I showed them the irrigation setup, the vegetable garden, and the tiny shed that contained nothing more dangerous than a rake and a bag of organic fertilizer. It didn't take long for the officers to realize they'd been given wildly false information. The sergeant in charge was furious about the wasted manpower. He asked if I knew who might have made the report, and I explained everything about Karen Peaton and her escalating harassment. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one who believed in recording things. The 911 call had been captured, as all emergency calls are. When the sergeant reviewed it, he heard Karen clearly telling the dispatcher to shoot if they resist about a homeowner who had committed no crime. Filing a false police report is already illegal, but telling officers to potentially kill someone pushes it well beyond that. The sergeant told me they would be launching a full investigation and strongly suggested I consider pressing charges. I didn't hesitate. I hired an attorney and filed charges for harassment, trespassing, and making false police reports. I also filed a civil lawsuit for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. My security footage became key evidence, documenting Karen repeatedly trespassing and showcasing her pattern of escalating harassment. The 911 recording was even more damning. It proved she had intentionally tried to create a situation that could have turned deadly. When news of the SWAT incident spread through Maple Ridge Estates, the neighborhood was stunned. Even residents who normally avoided HOA drama were horrified that Karen had pushed the situation so dangerously far. Several neighbors came forward with their own accounts of her intimidation and abuse of power. Tom Bradley revealed that Karen had been using HOA funds to hire private investigators to track certain residents she disliked. Susan Fletcher admitted Karen had forged violation notices and backdated them to increase fines. Tom Bradley newly emboldened after witnessing a full SWAT team mobilize because of Karen called for an emergency HOA meeting. The community center was packed, standing room only. Everyone wanted to hear how Karen would justify herself. She waltzed in 45 minutes late, acting as though she still ruled the entire subdivision, seemingly clueless about the fury in the room. She even attempted to call the meeting to order. Tom stood up and calmly told her she no longer had the authority to run anything. He introduced a motion to remove her as HOA president, citing gross misconducts, abuse of power, and actions that put a resident's life in danger. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she was protecting the neighborhood from a dangerous man. That's when I stood up and played the 911 recording from my phone, hooked up to a portable speaker I'd brought specifically for this moment. The room went dead silent as Karen's voice echoed through the hall, instructing the dispatcher to have the police shoot if I resisted. Audible gasps rippled across the room. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Karen's complexion drained from red to ghostly white as the weight of her actions hung in the air. She tried insisting the recording was altered or taken out of context, but it was far too late. The vote to remove her proceeded, and it was unanimous. Every single person, except Karen herself, voted to oust her. But the consequences didn't end with her removal. The district attorney decided to pursue criminal charges for filing a false police report and reckless endangerment. Karen was arrested at her home 2 weeks later. Ironically, she was the one who resisted this time, screaming about her rights and threatening lawsuits against everyone present. She was eventually convicted, sentenced to 200 hours of community service, and placed on 3 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay more than $15,000 in restitution for the SWAT response. My civil case was settled out of court, but not before Karen racked up enormous legal fees. Her homeowner's insurance refused to cover intentional misconduct, so every expense came straight from her own pocket. The financial stress became obvious when she put her house up for sale 3 months later. Last I heard, she relocated to another state, hopefully someplace where no one knows her HOA reputation. As for me, I remained in Maple Ridge Estates. The new HOA board, now led by Tom Bradley, issued a formal apology and refunded all the bogus fines Karen had levied. They also passed new bylaws drastically limiting board power and requiring video recording of all meetings. My vegetable garden is thriving, and I started a neighborhood gardening club where we share produce and tips. The SWAT incident became legendary, retold at every block party and barbecue. Someone even made a joke sign for my garden, warning, dangerous tomatoes. HOA approved. I keep it posted. Sometimes the only thing left to do is laugh at how absurd life can get. The day Karen was sentenced, she stood trembling in the courtroom, clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. When the judge announced the $15,000 restitution, she let out a mixture between a gasp and a shriek, and her attorney had to grab her arm to keep her from collapsing.